Some couples share an instant bond.
They were hot, they were heavy, and things were incredibly steamy between the two of them.
She was kind of swept off her feet, wanted to wine and dine her and really take care of her.
She had someone who wanted to be an active part of her life.
And that intense connection can grow into a common purpose.
They were struggling to make ends meet, so he turned to his past for a way out. She was all in, ready to face it together.
But what happens when that purpose blinds us to the difference between right and wrong?
She got in way too deep, but little did she know that what she was doing for her man was about to change the entire trajectory of her life.
December 2nd, 2016, Orlando, Florida. It's early morning in the city known as O-Town.
When people think of Orlando, they think about going to Disney World, they think about all the fun, just a real mecca for children, actually. It's like a dream, a fairy tale for people when they think about going to Orlando.
Orlando, Florida receives thousands and thousands of visitors every year. And typically people think of it as a very well tended to, well taken care of, fairly affluent area of the state. However, there is a portion of Orlando known as Pine Hill, which is in stark contrast to what we typically think of when we think of Orlando, Florida.
The Pine Hills neighborhood is hardly a magic kingdom.
Pine Hills, they call it Crime Hills because of so much crime.
There's a lot of issues over there. There's a lot of poverty, particularly in that area where you have poverty and the socioeconomic issues there. It leads to crime because a lot of the people that live there feel that they're trapped in some way. They can't advance to where they want to advance, so they resort to crime.
At 5 a.m., Barbara Webster is starting her morning work routine with a coworker at the Fresenius Medical Care Dialysis Center.
It was a beautiful day. We came in at 5 o'clock. By 6 o'clock, we were putting patients on the machine.
Suddenly, a coworker comes racing into the building in a panic. She's screaming that their colleague, Gregory Whitbeck, has just been shot.
Greg stumbled into the building, and when I saw him, I said, "What's going on? Are you okay?" And he just stumbled and did not know what was going on.
Barbara notices that Greg's leg is bleeding, but it's obvious to her that something else is wrong.
He just started trying to reach out for me, and so I opened up his shirt and then turned him around and saw the bullets in his back.
Greg loses consciousness, and Barbara lets her medical training take over.
And I started doing CPR right there and then. My thoughts was just, please, God, let him make it through. Please, just let him make it through.
Minutes later, EMTs arrive.
The first responders were able to get there pretty fast. Unfortunately, the injuries were too great, and Greg Whitbeck died at his beloved place of work, surrounded by his close friends and colleagues.
For Barbara, one of Greg's closest friends, the news is devastating.
I could not hold it, just screamed. They had to take me out of the clinic and take me in the back. It was like a dream. I mean, we lost somebody we cared about, loved so bad. Somebody that was the only man in there that we thought would protect us. And he was gone.
Gregory Whitbeck was born on January 21st, 1961, at Loring Air Force Base in Maine.
His father was in the Air Force. His mother, Evelyn, was a homemaker, and she took care of their 5 children that they had together. Greg was the only son, had 4 other sisters.
Of course, coming from a military parent, there was discipline, lots of it. However, though, there was no shortage of love. His sisters and him, they all knew that their father deeply loved them, and they had a nurturing and caring mother to take care of them.
As a military family, they moved from state to state and eventually reached the other end of the country.
By the time he entered middle school, he had moved to Washington State, and he attended Tacoma Junior Academy. When he went to high school, he attended Auburn Adventist Academy.
He moved up to the state of Washington and attended Walla Walla University for both his bachelor's and master's degree in social work.
After graduation, Greg and his father opened an assisted living facility in Washington State, which they ran for close to 20 years.
He honed his skills. He had a fantastic bedside manner. The patients loved him. His employees loved him. He was devoted, he was dedicated, and he really had a heart to serve his community.
When his dad retired, Greg decided to strike out on his own, moving to a sunnier climate.
He moved cross country all the way to Orange County, Florida, where he started his first job at a Head Start program.
Once again, serving the community, serving the children of that community, helping them to, gain better literacy skills, gain better educational resources, and just really serving the children of that underserved community.
A woman named Josette Zephyr came to his office. Greg was struck by her beauty and charm.
He was playing Kenny G music in the background, and she came in and asked him a couple of questions about some programs that were due to start later on that day, and from there they sparked up a conversation.
They start talking, and then the chemistry's there.
Greg told Josette he had a daughter named Crystal from a previous relationship. Any concern that she might be turned off by this quickly vanished.
That can be a little bit tricky because that might push a love interest away. If they're not prepared to step into that role, if they're not prepared to take on a child as their own, that can be a little off-putting. But Josette was totally open to it.
In fact, it seemed to captivate her even more. Just the fact that he was a family man and he had honor and integrity.
Greg and Josette soon found themselves embarking on a whirlwind romance.
They had a great relationship starting out. They were best friends. They talked about everything. They were excited to see that love blossom. On September 20th, 2008, Greg and Josette made it official and became husband and wife. About a year later, Greg also transitioned into a new role at a kidney dialysis facility in Orlando. He really helps those people in the community that are facing kidney issues and having to undergo dialysis. So he tends to their physical care, their mental health. He helps them socially to get everything that they need in order to receive the care that they deserve.
Greg spent 13 years at the center. During that time, he and his co-workers grew extremely close.
It was more than just friends. We were a family in this clinic. He cared about people.
But now, Greg is dead after a shooting in the parking lot of the dialysis center where he worked. Homicide detectives arrive at the scene and begin questioning Barbara and the other employees.
The first question detectives asked is why was Greg outside in the parking lot?
When Greg came in, I was in the back getting ready to go on break, and Greg said that he was going to go back outside to drop some papers off to somebody, another social worker.
Crime scene analysts searched the parking lot and find one .32 caliber shell casing.
At first glance, the details didn't quite add up. Greg has appeared to be shot twice, once in the leg and once in the back, but only one shell casing was found. Since it happened in a parking lot, it's possible the second shell casing rolled away or either got caught in the suspect's clothing.
They make note of the caliber of the gun because that's going to become relevant in ascertaining the murder weapon.
Police then canvass the area, looking for anyone who might have witnessed the shooting.
They, of course, interview the person who called 911, and that was Kristen Ayers, the employee at the Dunkin' Donuts in the same strip plaza. And she described for them what she saw exactly. She noticed that Greg Whitbeck was outside in the parking lot, and a vehicle pulled up. And it was a silver grayish vehicle. And she noticed two people in the vehicle. She noticed a young man who looked young, probably in his mid to late 20s. And she also noticed a female who was behind the wheel of the vehicle.
She recalls that the young man quickly got out of the passenger side of the car and approached Greg.
They basically exchanged words. She did not hear the words, but it didn't seem friendly. And after that, she noticed that they were physically wrestling.
Kristen says that shortly after, she heard 2 gunshots ring out and then saw Greg doubled over.
He gripped his side and leaned over as though he had been injured.
He was kind of slumped over, hunched over, grabbing his side and stumbling, fumbling back into the medical facility.
Kristen tells detectives that the young man jumped back into the car and it sped off. She then raced to the phone and called 911.
Of course, it frightened her because they're in Pine Hills. She was scared, and she called the police.
She said the young black male who was the passenger looked to be about 5'10" with a slim build. And she also noticed that the driver was a black female.
She didn't really get a great description of the female as she was in the driver's side, but she did notice that there were 2 assailants in the vehicle.
Given that the shooting has taken place in a high-crime area, detectives have to wonder if the shooting may have been a robbery gone bad.
In fact, in the 2 months prior to Greg's murder, there had been 8 reported shootings in the Pine Hill neighborhood, with 5 people killed and 5 more injured.
The witness provides one other detail. She says that when the car fled, she noticed something unusual about the rear license plate.
She said the license plate looked like it was paper, which probably mean it was a temporary tag. And that usually mean that the car was either new or recently had been sold.
It's not much of a lead, but right now, it's the only lead that detectives have.
Community leader and beloved social worker Greg Whitbeck is tragically shot in the parking lot of the medical clinic where he worked. The Pine Hills community in Orlando is known to be a rough and tumble neighborhood with more than its share of random violence.
The detectives had to take into account the area that they were in. There had already been previous shootings, other crimes that had already taken place, so they weren't sure if this was just some random robbery gone wrong or what.
But when detectives check Greg's clothing, they find his wallet. Nothing appears to have been stolen.
On the surface, that might suggest that it wasn't a robbery gone bad. But the witness at Dunkin' Donuts said she saw Greg and the man tussling. So that might mean that Greg refused to give the man his wallet, and that's why he was shot.
Police begin the difficult task of notifying Greg's family of his death. His wife, Josette, is stunned by the news.
She was devastated. She was distraught. She broke out into tears. She reacted in a way that was you'd expect for someone who lost a husband.
They asked if Greg was having problems with anyone. Did he have any enemies or anyone that might want to do him harm? She said everyone loved Greg.
She told them she had no idea who would want to harm her husband.
They also asked Josette about her relationship with Greg.
Do they have a happy marriage? Has there been any marital conflict in recent history? And Josette says everything is great. They have a loving relationship. Nothing is wrong.
Detectives then visit with Greg's mother and sisters. Most are shocked by Greg's passing, but one sister, Diane, is not.
Diane has quite a bit to say about her sister-in-law, Josette, where Josette made it seem like her, Greg, and their daughter, Crystal, were one big happy family. Diane had an entirely different story to tell.
Diane says that while the marriage may have begun as a fairy tale, it eventually turned into a nightmare for Greg.
Diane says that Josette and Greg were anything but happy. In the later years, they had a lot of issues. Josette had become very confrontational, often being very insecure and accusing Greg of possibly cheating on her or disrespecting their marriage. Things were very argumentative and just contemptuous between the two of them.
As we know, many times sisters can be so overprotective of their brothers. She had a lot to say when it came to law enforcement. She told them his wife was verbally abusive. The relationship had turned totally toxic. He didn't feel as though there was anything that could salvage their relationship.
Diane tells detectives that Greg had an epiphany the night before he was murdered.
Greg had come to their mother's house and had dinner with her and her mother. And Greg told his mother that he has planned on leaving Josette, and he's finally done with her for good.
He told his mother, if anything happens to me, look to Josette.
Diane then tells detectives that when Greg began complaining about Josette several months earlier, she decided to do a little sleuthing.
Diane has done her own independent investigation on her sister-in-law, and she has found some shocking evidence. She's found that Josette has been married 6 times before, which is just shocking to her.
In addition to that, she used multiple aliases. She had fake birth certificates and a whole bunch of other things that would just make anyone think, what's really going on here? Why all the aliases? Why all the marriages?
She's not even sure if Josette is her real name.
Detectives ponder this new information. Why would Josette murder Greg? Why not simply divorce him? Diane thinks she has the answer.
Greg had a sizable 401k. Was it possible that she could have done a murder to get that money? Detectives always know that money is a very powerful motive.
Detectives return to the dialysis center to ask Greg's co-workers about the accusations. Barbara Weston confirms that Josette was extremely jealous.
Greg could not have friends at work. He did everything he could, to make her sure that, these are just co-workers, these are family, these are just friends.
Co-workers say Josette would even surprise Greg at his office, hoping to catch him with another woman.
His wife had shown up to the facility several times with some bizarre behavior, causing a scene, being very aggressive.
She would just come and just show up and just, it was a place of work, and he was well respected by his patients and his friends. And to show up and argue, and that was not Greg.
Any person that goes to, your spouse's job to wreak havoc and say all these crazy, outlandish things, that speaks a lot.
According to co-workers, Josette's behavior forced the office to take extreme measures.
We had to block her. The boss actually had to block her from coming to the clinic.
Josette's bizarre behavior and apparent threats have made her the #1 suspect in Greg's murder.
The eyewitness said Greg was shot by a man, but she also said that a woman was driving the silver sedan.
December 4th, 2016. The family and friends of 55-year-old social worker Greg Whitbeck have told Orlando, Florida police detectives that they suspect his estranged wife, Josette, may have been involved in his murder.
They know she can't be the shooter because witnesses say it was a man. But a woman was driving the getaway car, and that could have been Josette.
Detectives obtain a photograph of Josette and return to the Dunkin' Donuts and their main eyewitness, Kristen Ayers.
They ask Kristen if Josette looks familiar. Was this the getaway driver of the vehicle that you saw the morning of Greg's murder? And Kristen cannot confirm or deny. It was quite a bit of a distance away. It was from an angle that she was watching all of this happen. And again, she was in the middle of work, kind of back and forth, dealing with customers and watching the scenario unfold.
Kristen describes the vehicle as a silver sedan. Motor vehicle records show that Josette doesn't own such a vehicle.
That doesn't clear her. The vehicle might have belonged to the man that did the shooting, or it may have been borrowed or rented. There is no way to tell at this point.
Detectives look further into Josette's whereabouts the day of the murder, and they don't really find anything that would raise any alarm bells for them. They did not find any cell tower pings, coming from her cell phone number at the time of the murder. So they're led to believe that if Josette is involved, it would be more of a murder for hire plot versus Josette physically being involved in what occurred that day.
Detectives return to Josette's house for a second interview, but she sticks to her story.
They asked her, is there any problems in the relationship? Is there anything we should be aware of? She told them they had a great relationship and that there was nothing going on, and she had no idea who would want to harm her husband.
They even asked Greg's daughter, Crystal, if she noticed anything unusual around the house. But she was in the dark as to what was going on between her dad and Josette.
She didn't have any information because her dad had worked very hard to shelter her from knowing his marital problems. He believed that grown people needed to handle their business and keep kids out of it and protect his daughters, what he did. So Crystal was none the wiser. She had no idea that her father and stepmother weren't getting along or that their marriage was in shambles.
Detectives appear to hit a dead end. But back at the station, as they comb through police reports, they uncover unusual activity in the Pine Hills neighborhood on the morning of Greg's murder.
In the 90 minutes or so preceding the shooting at the dialysis center, 2 armed robberies took place, both of them involving a silver sedan.
The first robbery involved a young man named Houston Willis.
He was on his bicycle heading into work, and he describes that a car, a silver grayish vehicle, pulled up in front of the path of his bicycle and stopped him from moving any further. Houston describes that the young man jumps out of the passenger side of the vehicle and holds him at gunpoint. Then he yells at his driver to get out of the vehicle and grab his backpack. And then they both jump in the car and speed off.
The brazen robbery nets the bandits very little money.
Houston says that the only thing he had in his backpack at the time was his cell phone and his wallet containing just $3. But he was traumatized nonetheless.
He gave the detectives a general description of the two robbers, who seemed to match the couple that killed Greg Whitbeck. It all happened so fast that he wasn't really able to study their faces or give any real details.
Houston's description of the vehicle matches that seen by the Dunkin' Donuts employee when Greg Whitbeck was shot. About an hour later, a woman named Carla Mitchell comes to the station to share her story of a similar encounter at an Orlando daycare center.
Detectives interview Carla Mitchell, who was getting her 3-month-old child out of the car in the parking lot of the daycare facility where her child attended.
She says the male passenger, which she describes as a young black man, points a gun in her face and orders her to give him her valuables.
She has a headset that's valued at about $150, a cell phone, and her wallet containing $140 cash.
She says the man jumped back into the vehicle and drove off.
Again, everything happened so fast that she can't give a detailed description of the robbers. Black male, medium height, and build. But it's the same general description as the other witnesses. And she also says they are driving a small silver sedan.
This time, there's another witness, a security guard who is stationed across the street.
He saw what was going on, and he was able to see the tags on the vehicle, and he noted that they were temporary tags.
This vehicle with the temporary license plate is the very same vehicle and description of the vehicle that pulled into the parking lot and killed Greg Whitbeck. This vehicle with the temporary license plate was the break in the case that the police needed.
3 days after the fatal shooting of Greg Whitbeck in the parking lot of an Orlando dialysis center, investigators have uncovered their first major break in the case. The silver sedan seen fleeing the scene the day of the murder matches the description of a vehicle seen at 2 other robberies.
The robbery of the bicyclist happened first, about 90 minutes before Greg's shooting. And the robbery at the daycare was just 15 minutes before Greg was shot. So they all happened about the same time and in the same general area.
The description of the robbers are the same. The description of the vehicles are the same. So there is little doubt that these robbers are connected, committed by the same 2 people.
Detectives run the tag through motor vehicle records and learn it is registered to a 24-year-old woman named April Koger. April Koger was born in 1992 in Orlando, Florida. She gave birth to her first child while still in high school. A second child came 3 years later. April quickly found herself struggling to provide for her family.
The father of her children didn't even want to have anything to do with his own children. He was not in their lives. He wasn't providing any kind of financial, emotional, or physical support for the children.
April really had no means to provide for her children, so she ended up moving in with her mother.
But April saw a ray of hope when 23-year-old Kenny Cheney walked into her life.
April says that she was kind of swept off her feet by Kenny. He kind of came in and just wanted to be the man for her, wanted to wine and dine her and really take care of her.
He was a lifeline. He came to her rescue. He was a good father figure for her children. He seemed to be family oriented and seemed to be exactly what she wanted and needed.
But as time went on, their financial troubles grew. Kenny, who had a criminal record, couldn't seem to find steady work anywhere.
Given his criminal background, as you can imagine, it was hard for him to find employment that would really provide for himself and April and the 2 children. It just became a challenge to make ends meet for the both of them.
Kenny, who wanted to provide for his newfound family, became stressed. And April did her best to encourage him, telling him to stay positive, hoping their luck would change.
With the license plate to April's car matching the silver sedan seen at the robbery scenes, detectives go to April's home. But neither April nor her car are present. They decide to use a different tactic.
They're also able to determine that the vehicle was recently purchased from a local establishment called Sam's Auto Sales. They also go down to Sam's and they are able to speak with the salesperson who sold the vehicle. He says that their facility is a buy here, pay here lot, which enables people to purchase the vehicles and pay the bill over time.
The salesman also tells detectives that April's car, like most of the cars they sell, is equipped with a GPS tracking device.
All the buy here, pay here that I know of, they have GPS tracking devices because a lot of times those buy here, pay here car dealerships, the cars end up getting repoed because they can't afford the payments.
When people get behind on their cars, they disable the cars and then they're able to track where it is and go pick it up to repossess it.
The salesman provides all of the tracking data from April's car. It's an aha moment for detectives.
They are able to determine that the silver gray vehicle that was sold at that facility was actually present at each of the locations of all 3 robberies at the time that the robberies occurred.
The salesman has something else for detectives.
The GPS tracker is not only able to track previous locations, but is able to track the current location. That is exactly what law enforcement needed.
And they find out where the car was, which was not too far from the house.
Detectives send officers to the location of the vehicle, warning them that the occupants are likely armed and dangerous.
When they get there, what will they discover? Will it be a peaceful surrender, or will it be a shootout?
With the help of a car salesman and GPS tracking data, investigators have identified the vehicle used in the murder of Greg Whitbeck. Now, Orlando police officers are heading to the location of the car and its likely driver, 24-year-old April Koger.
Detectives know that the robberies and the murder was committed by a man and a woman, and that it was the man that was armed with the handgun. Will this man be with her? Are they now outright committing more robberies? Nobody knows.
Police spot the silver sedan in a residential neighborhood. There's only one occupant in the car, a woman.
She identifies herself as April Koger. They explain to her that she has a warrant out for her arrest, and she peacefully surrenders.
They are most concerned about also apprehending her accomplice, the male accomplice in these crimes. April tells detectives that her accomplice is 23-year-old Kenny Cheney, her boyfriend, and he is staying with her at her home on Imogene Court.
The officers run a background check on Kenny Cheney. They learn he is no stranger to law enforcement.
Kenny has a very long rap sheet. He has committed several crimes over the years, and he's currently on probation for armed robbery. Armed with all of this information, the police are able to obtain a warrant for Kenny Cheney's arrest.
The police go to April's home, and Kenny opens up the door. He peacefully surrenders.
Armed with a warrant, investigators search the home for evidence of the crimes.
They find a .32 caliber pistol, which is the same caliber that was used in the murder of Greg Whitbeck. They also find 2 cell phones and a purse belonging to Carla Mitchell. They also find the backpack that belonged to Houston Willis that was stolen from him in the armed robbery that he described.
Detectives are confident that April Koger and Kenny Cheney are the 2 people responsible for the string of robberies and Greg Whitbeck's murder, but they want to hear it from them.
Detectives are able to sit down with April for an interview, and they notice that she is super nervous. And April admits that she's never been in trouble with the law before. She's feeling very unsettled, and because of that, she agrees to be very forthcoming, very transparent.
April tells detectives about how she met and then fell for Kenny. He was everything her children's father wasn't, and tried to take care of her and her kids.
She had someone who was there and who actually was present and concerned and wanted to be an active part of her life.
But his criminal record made it hard for him to get and keep a job. And Kenny noticed that he was disappointing April by not being able to provide for her.
April tells detectives that as the holidays approached, Kenny decided to take action.
Christmas was right around the corner, and he wanted to provide gifts for the kids and April, and he came up with this plan to make money fast. He told April that he wanted to take the little money that they had and buy a vehicle and go out and find easy victims to rob.
April says she simply trusted Kenny and agreed to go along with the plan.
She had no criminal history. She had not been involved in anything like this before. So to her, naively, if you will, it seemed like this was a good option.
She says Kenny wanted to commit the robberies early in the morning when there would be few witnesses. Minutes before 5 a.m., they spotted Houston Willis on his bike.
He looked like an easy target. It was just him by himself, not really any witnesses around.
He put the gun to him, and he only got $3 from it in a phone. So that wasn't a good lick.
Their next target is a woman carrying a baby. But again, their haul is less than expected.
Carla only had about $140 in cash in her purse and some electronics worth about $150. But that was really still not enough for them to do anything with. So they continued looking for their next victim. And they happened to pull up by the shopping center where they noticed Greg Whitbeck standing outside in his white lab coat.
He thought 3 times would be a charm. I know this man. He has a coat. He's a doctor. He has money. This is our lick right here.
What they didn't anticipate was that Greg was a fighter. So he actually, wrestled with Kenny in that parking lot. And unfortunately, Kenny, either inadvertently or intentionally, pulled the trigger and shot Greg twice in order to get his money.
April says she never anticipated someone would be shot. Kenny jumped back into the car and ordered her to flee.
In his haste to get away, Kenny didn't even take Greg's wallet. In other words, he killed him for nothing.
All the evidence seems to be pointing toward an armed robbery gone wrong. But detectives still have questions about Greg's wife, Josette.
Was this just 2 individuals trying to make money to feed their children? Or did Josette hire these 2 individuals to commit a murder and make it seem like an armed robbery gone wrong?
Orlando detectives have compelling evidence that April Koger and her boyfriend, Kenny Cheney, are responsible for a series of armed robberies and the murder of Greg Whitbeck.
April Koger freely admitted her role in the crimes to detectives. And when police bring in Kenny Cheney for an interview, he does the same.
Kenny confessed to shooting Greg in the parking lot in front of the dialysis center. April confessed to being the driver and being an accomplice in all of the robberies.
Both are charged with murder, second-degree murder, armed robbery, and attempted armed robbery. When detectives inform Greg's family that his killers have been caught, they are less than satisfied.
They're not convinced that it was just some random robbery gone wrong. What they really want to know is, did Greg's wife have anything to do with this?
Investigators re-interview Kenny and show him a photo of Greg's wife, Josette.
They ask Kenny if he's able to identify the woman in the picture, and Kenny makes it clear that he has never seen this woman before in his life. She is a complete stranger, totally foreign to him, and he seems very sincere.
Detectives even went so far to look through Josette's bank records to see if there was any evidence that she paid someone to kill Greg. And there was nothing, so they were able to finally rule her out.
April's trial is scheduled to begin in February 2018. As the date approaches, prosecutors present her with a deal. April accepts.
Given the charges against April, it could have been a potential life sentence, but the DA offered April 17 years in prison in exchange for her testimony against Kenny as the planner of the crime and the gunman in the crime.
Kenny Cheney eventually pleads guilty to all the charges and is sentenced to life in prison. The convictions are little solace to the family and friends of Greg Whitbeck.
In one sense, it was comfort that they got caught, but at the same time, we were still angry about it. Just angry because it didn't have to be that way.
By the time April Koger is released from prison, her 2 children will be adults, and she will have missed most of their childhood years.
The crimes that she committed for her man in the name of love, they were blinding to her. It skewed her judgment. She didn't make the right decisions. And now she has to live with that guilt for the rest of her life, away from her children.
And she said that she was just following the lead of her man because they were on hard times. She could have said no, but he assured her, and she trusted him. This should be a big lesson to young women in any kind of situation like this.
Young women feel that they need a man that's out there being tough and bad and just robbing and just, they like that fast life. It's not about the fast life. You don't need that kind of life because like April, look where she ended up. In prison for what? You just ruined your whole life.
Sharing a common purpose can lay a strong foundation.
The Florida heat of 1988 didn't just simmer. It boiled, trapped beneath a suffocating blanket of humidity that seemed to swallow the secrets of a quiet, sun-drenched suburban street in a sleepy corner of the state. It was the kind of neighborhood where the sound of a lawnmower was the most threatening noise you'd ever hear, a place where trust was the currency and a locked door was an anomaly. But on one sweltering July evening, that normalcy shattered. A young woman, vibrant and full of promise, walked out her front door to collect the mail and simply ceased to exist. There were no screams, no witnesses, no tire tracks in the sand, only an abandoned mailbox and a lingering sense of wrongness that refused to dissipate even as the sun set. The investigation that unfolded in the following days was a frantic, desperate scramble against the encroaching silence, a whirlwind of yellow tape and flashing lights that felt like a localized fever dream. Detectives combed through every inch of the neighborhood, their voices growing hoarse from interviewing neighbors who had seen nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing. It was as if she had been snatched by the very atmosphere itself, pulled into the thick, humid air and erased. The initial urgency, the promise of a swift resolution, slowly bled away, replaced by the hollow, crushing weight of a cold case that would refuse to yield its secrets for 38 long, agonizing years. Every lead that surfaced felt like a lifeline, only to snap under the pressure of scrutiny, leaving the investigators staring at a void that grew darker with every passing season. They chased drifters, they interrogated local lowlives, they even looked at the victim's closest friends, but the truth remained stubbornly out of reach, hidden in the shadows of a reality that refused to be mapped. The neighborhood, once a bastion of shared life, turned into a collection of islands, each resident retreating behind blinds and shutters, the collective gaze shifting from curiosity to suspicion. It was a cold case that became a monument to failure, a stain on the record of a department that had given everything and received nothing in return. As the years peeled away, the case moved from the active desk to the dusty archives, a file relegated to the purgatory of the unsolved. Yet, beneath the surface of the community, the memory of the vanished girl persisted, a phantom limb that still ached whenever the anniversary of her disappearance rolled around. The detectives didn't forget, they couldn't. They carried the weight of her unfinished story like a second skin, the unanswered questions festering in the back of their minds like a slow-moving poison. The breakthrough didn't arrive with a bang or a cinematic reveal. It came from the silent, relentless march of forensic technology, the kind of science that hadn't even been a whisper in the halls of justice when the woman first went missing. It began with a reanalysis of the original evidence, a microscopic look at the fibers and the biological residue that had been trapped in the preservation of time. They found a match, a genetic signature that was too small, too faint to have been detected decades earlier, but which now screamed a name that had been buried in the files since the very beginning. The name wasn't that of a drifter or a stranger from across the state. It was the name of a man who had been a fixture of the very street where the tragedy occurred. A man who had been there, in the periphery of their vision, for nearly 4 decades. A man who had lived, breathed, and operated within inches of the victim's home, his existence seamlessly woven into the tapestry of the community he had violated. The realization was not just a shock, it was a physical blow, a moment of profound, nauseating clarity that turned the entire history of the case on its head. He had been the neighbor, the man who waved from across the fence, the man who had been interviewed during the initial investigation, the man who had sat there, perfectly still, while they searched for a monster that was sitting right in front of them. The arrest team moved with a precision that belied the years of frustration, their arrival on the quiet, sun-beaten street almost surreal in its normalcy. Neighbors peered through their windows, the same windows that had been used to search for clues in 1988, as the men in uniform swarmed the house that had stood as a silent, unassuming neighbor for so long. The suspect, an aging, silver-haired man who looked like any other retiree, didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply watched, his face a mask of impenetrable, decades-old indifference, as the cuffs clicked into place. It was the end of a hunt that had consumed generations of detectives, a moment of closure that felt heavier than anyone had imagined. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence, a slow-spreading realization dawning on everyone that the monster hadn't been under the bed or in the woods. He had been the man who held the neighborhood barbecue, the man who borrowed a cup of sugar, the man who was always there, lurking in the plain sight of their own misguided trust. The news spread like a wildfire, a shockwave that hit the community with the force of a tectonic shift, forcing everyone to reconsider the very nature of the ground they stood on. How could they not have known? How could the man they had accepted as one of their own have been capable of such a profound, lingering horror? The questions that had once been focused on the missing girl now shifted toward the nature of the man who had lived next door, a man who had successfully kept his darkness hidden behind a veil of neighborly normalcy for nearly half a century. The interrogation that followed was a masterclass in the unmasking of a life built on a foundation of lies. The suspect, confronted with the irrefutable evidence of his own DNA, slowly began to lose the composure he had maintained for all those years. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic confession, but a slow, peeling away of the layers he had constructed. He spoke of the day, of the heat, of the impulsive nature of his act, his voice flat and devoid of the remorse that the detectives were desperate to find. He had been watching her, he said, his eyes tracing the outlines of her life for months before he finally decided to act. He had been right there, watching her walk to the mailbox, watching her laugh, watching her live, his own dark desires festering in the quiet, humid air of the Florida summer. The detectives sat in that small, windowless room, their hearts hardening as they heard the clinical, matter-of-fact account of the murder. It was a reality that went beyond the cold case. It was a reality of a human life that had been treated as nothing more than a convenient, disposable object for the satisfaction of an internal, twisted urge. The suspect had lived his life, he had raised his own family, he had grown old, all while carrying the secret of his crime like a heavy, cold stone in his stomach. He had walked the same sidewalks, seen the same faces, and existed in the same shared space as the victim's own family, an invisible presence of evil that had never once been called to account until the science finally caught up. As the case moved toward the legal system, the community found itself in a state of profound, collective mourning. The closure they had sought for decades had come, but it brought with it a new, darker weight. They were no longer mourning just the loss of the girl. They were mourning the loss of their own sense of safety, the realization that they had been blind to the threat in their own backyard. The victim's family, who had spent decades waiting for a sign, for a clue, for an answer, were finally forced to confront the absolute, devastating reality of their loss. The truth was not a cure. It was a scar that had been reopened, a raw, throbbing wound that would never fully heal. They sat in the courtroom, their eyes fixed on the man who had broken their world, their silence echoing through the hall with a power that no lawyer's argument could ever possess. The suspect, now stripped of his anonymity, looked small, insignificant, and hollowed out, a man who had lived a life of quiet deception and was now facing the inevitable, cold light of the consequences he had evaded for 38 years. The trial was not just a legal battle, it was a reckoning, a public examination of the choices that had been made, the secrets that had been kept, and the lives that had been irrevocably altered by the darkness of one man's actions. Every piece of evidence presented, every witness called, was a layer removed, revealing the depth of the betrayal that had defined the neighborhood for so long. The jury, a group of people drawn from the very community that had lived with the shadow of this crime, faced an impossible task. They were not just deciding on the guilt of a man, they were deciding on the narrative of their own history. They listened to the accounts, they looked at the photographs, and they felt the weight of the years pressing down on them. The evidence, bolstered by the modern forensic confirmation, was absolute. The link between the man next door and the missing girl was not just a connection, it was an undeniable reality that had been hiding in plain sight. When the verdict of guilty was finally read, the courtroom didn't erupt. It fell into a deep, hollow silence, the kind of silence that marks the end of a long, exhausting journey. The suspect was led away, a man who would now spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell, the very space he had restricted his victim to all those years ago. It was a victory, yes, but it was a victory that left everyone feeling diminished, a recognition that justice, while necessary, can never fully compensate for the time that has been stolen or the lives that have been cut short. The cold case was solved, but the trauma of it was not. It was merely redefined, transformed into a piece of public record that would forever define the history of the neighborhood. The aftermath of the trial left the city in a strange, limbo state, a place that was both relieved and deeply unsettled. The news crews that had flooded the streets eventually left, their stories told, their headlines written, leaving behind a neighborhood that had to find a way to live with the truth it had finally been forced to confront. The residents began the slow, painful process of trying to rebuild their sense of community, of trying to understand how the ordinary could mask the extraordinary, how the familiar could hide the lethal. They started talking again, but the conversations were different now, more cautious, more guarded, as if everyone was walking on eggshells. They had learned the hard way that trust is a fragile thing, and that the person living next door might not be the person you think they are. The neighborhood was a place where everyone was now checking, looking closer, and listening more intently to the subtle, underlying sounds of the life that was moving around them. It was a transformation of the soul, a slow-motion awakening that was as painful as it was necessary. As the years continue to turn, the story of the 1988 cold case will remain, a part of the local lore, a reminder that the shadows of the past can never be truly outrun, only eventually forced into the light where they are compelled to face the judgment they so long evaded. The victim's family continues to find ways to honor her life, to keep her memory alive in the quiet, dignified way that they have always done, their resilience a testament to the fact that love can persist even in the face of the most profound, calculated violence. They are the ones who carry the story forward, who ensure that the girl who was snatched away so many years ago is not forgotten, not by the neighborhood, and not by the world. They are the light in the dark, the ones who had to navigate the most difficult of paths, and their survival is the most triumphant part of the entire ordeal. The neighborhood, in its quiet, sun-drenched way, is still there, the lawnmowers still hum, and the mail is still delivered, but the silence that followed the trial is a different kind of silence, a silence that is no longer filled with questions, but with the quiet, persistent truth of what happened on that sweltering July day so long ago. The investigators who had worked the case, who had carried the file in their hearts, finally found the peace they had sought for all those years. They walked the streets, no longer as hunters, but as neighbors, their presence a quiet, understated reminder of the work they had done to bring the truth home. They didn't seek the spotlight, they didn't ask for praise, they simply lived their lives, their sense of purpose fulfilled by the knowledge that they had finally, at long last, provided the answers that the family needed. They were the ones who had been there at the beginning, and they were the ones who were there at the end, their persistence the catalyst for the entire, long overdue resolution. They were the men who had finally looked the monster in the eye and, with the help of the science of the future, had finally put him where he belonged. The final, lingering impression of the 1988 Florida cold case is one of both the frailty and the endurance of human life. It's a story of a moment, a single, impulsive act that tore a hole in the fabric of a community and left it reeling for nearly 40 years. But it's also a story of the people who refused to let that hole define them, who refused to let the silence win, and who fought, with every fiber of their being, to ensure that the truth would eventually surface. It's a story of the power of memory, the persistence of hope, and the undeniable reality that the truth, no matter how long it's hidden, will always, eventually, find its way into the light. The neighborhood, once a place of innocence, is now a place of wisdom, a community that knows the cost of the past and the value of the present. The sun continues to beat down on the Florida streets, the humidity still hangs in the air, and the mail is still delivered every single day, but the neighborhood is changed. It's no longer the place where the girl went missing. It's the place where the truth was finally found. And that truth, that simple, devastating, and necessary truth, is what remains. It's the final, permanent record of the girl who was the man who did and the community that refused to forget. And as the story is told and retold, as the years continue to pass, that truth will continue to burn, a bright, unwavering light in the dark, reminding everyone who hears it that even in the most quiet, sun-drenched streets, the shadow of the truth is always there, waiting for the moment to be found. The case is closed, the truth is told, and the neighborhood, the resilient, changed, and forever altered neighborhood, is finally, at long last, home. The long, long hunt is over, the monster is gone, and the girl, the vibrant, forgotten girl, is finally, at long last, returned to the light. The truth is the final answer, and in the silence that follows, there is only the peace of a story finally, at long last, brought to its end. The sun sets, the shadows stretch, and the neighborhood rests, its history written, its secrets out, and its truth, that beautiful, final, and absolute truth, is at peace. The hunt for justice is done, and in the end, that is all that ever truly matters. The light, the truth, and the peace of a story well told. The light is home, the truth is found, and the darkness, the long, long darkness of the 1988 cold case, is finally, forever, gone. The immediate aftermath of the arrest acted as a catalyst for a psychological unraveling within the community that no one had truly anticipated. When the news surfaced that the man who had been a quiet, background fixture of the neighborhood, a neighbor who had helped with roof repairs and occasionally joined the block parties, was the architect of such a profound, decades-old tragedy, the social fabric of the street began to fray in real time. It was as if the very air in the neighborhood had changed. The sun-drenched porches and manicured lawns, which had once been symbols of an idyllic, safe suburban existence, now appeared as staging grounds for a lie that had sustained itself for 38 years. Residents stopped gathering at the mailboxes. The casual waves exchanged between neighbors while taking out the trash were replaced by tense, averted gazes. The terror was not in the mystery anymore. It was in the banality of the predator. They had to look at their own lives and wonder, who else had been smiling while harboring such a secret? The investigation intensified as the detectives moved from the initial arrest to the systematic dismantling of the suspect's life. They secured search warrants for the house that had been his home for nearly 4 decades. It was an eerie, unsettling experience for the seasoned investigators to step inside a space that had been so carefully curated to appear normal. They found family photos, neatly organized shelves, and the mundane debris of an aging man's life, all of which now felt like props in a long-running, sinister play. The detectives worked with a clinical, disciplined focus, knowing that somewhere within these walls there might be more evidence, other trophies, other records, perhaps the missing pieces of a puzzle that had spanned across various state lines. Every item they bagged, every document they scanned, was a piece of a shattered narrative being put back together. The silence of the house, which had been home to a killer, was heavy and stifling, as if the very walls had absorbed the gravity of the secret he had kept tucked away. As the detectives delved deeper, they unearthed a series of journals and personal ledgers hidden beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom. These were not the poetic, confession-heavy accounts one finds in movies. They were cold, detached logs of time, distance, and observation. He had been a man of terrifying discipline, a predator who treated his impulses as a structured project to be managed. He had meticulously documented his interactions, his observations of the victim, and even the police activity during the frantic days of the initial 1988 search. Reading these entries was like looking into a void. There was no remorse, no epiphany, just a clinical documentation of how he had outmaneuvered the law. The detectives read these passages with a sense of mounting nausea, realizing that the man they had interviewed so many years ago had been documenting their own investigative incompetence in real time. The impact on the victim's family, who had waited nearly 4 decades for an answer, was catastrophic in its emotional depth. The resolution they had prayed for, the definitive closure that would finally allow them to move forward, arrived with the devastating realization that justice had been delayed for so long that it felt more like a hollow mockery than a triumph. They were forced to relive the agony of 1988, but this time with the added weight of knowing that the killer had been living just a few houses away, watching them grow old, watching them mourn, and watching them live their shattered lives. The indignity of that reality was a new kind of trauma, a secondary violence that had been inflicted upon them every day for 38 years. The detectives spent countless hours with the family, trying to provide the support they needed as they navigated the harrowing legal proceedings ahead, but they knew that words were a weak currency for the debt that was owed to these people. In the precinct, the atmosphere was one of quiet, somber professionalism. The team had achieved the impossible, but there was no room for celebration. The victory felt stained by the reality of the systemic failure that had allowed such a crime to remain unsolved for so long. They held daily briefings, but they weren't about the thrill of the chase. They were about the painful, methodical process of building a case that would ensure no loopholes were left for the defense to exploit. They were perfectionists, driven by a deep-seated need to make up for the decades of missed opportunities. The technology that had finally cracked the case, the advanced genetic genealogy, was now a standard part of their arsenal, but they viewed it with a mix of reverence and resentment. If this tool had been available in the 90s, in the early 2000s, how many other lives might have been spared? How many other cold cases could have been resolved? The neighborhood, meanwhile, became the site of a strange, morbid pilgrimage. True crime enthusiasts and journalists from all over the country descended upon the street, their presence a constant, intrusive reminder of the neighborhood's newly minted infamy. It created a deep, internal conflict among the residents. They wanted to return to their private, quiet lives, but they felt a collective obligation to speak for the girl who had been silenced. They found themselves becoming the accidental custodians of a memory they had once been desperate to forget. The tensions grew as some residents advocated for the total demolition of the suspect's house, a symbolic purging of the darkness, while others worried that tearing it down would be an attempt to sanitize a history that needed to be faced. The suspect's legal defense team began their work, and as expected, they were aggressive and clinical. They pushed for changes of venue, they attacked the validity of the DNA evidence, and they attempted to portray their client as a man who had lived a quiet, reformed life for decades. It was a strategy designed to induce fatigue in the prosecution and the public alike. They hoped that if they could drag the case out for long enough, the memory of the crime would lose its sharp, terrifying edges. But they underestimated the resolve of the community and the persistence of the investigative team. The detectives, who had by now become synonymous with the case, remained the bedrock of the prosecution's effort, their testimony the final, unassailable wall that the defense could not hope to breach. As the weeks of preparation turned into months, the detectives started to uncover even more disturbing connections. Through the suspect's financial records and long-buried employment logs, they found that he had traveled frequently in the mid-90s, often to areas where other unsolved disappearances had been reported. It was a chilling revelation that suggested the 1988 case was not an outlier, but a focal point for a broader pattern of behavior that had potentially extended across multiple states. The team was effectively reopening a series of chapters that had been thought to be finished, transforming a single cold case solution into a complex, multi-jurisdictional investigation. This was a nightmare of paperwork and coordination, but they worked with an obsessive, relentless energy. They weren't just solving a murder. They were cataloging the career of a predator who had operated in the shadows for a generation. The emotional fatigue began to set in. The detectives, many of whom had been working together for years, found themselves becoming more silent, more introspective. They had spent their lives staring into the abyss, and for the first time, the abyss was staring back, not through the mystery, but through the mundane reality of the perpetrator's existence. They had to reconcile the fact that they were hunting a man who was just like everyone else, a grandfather, a retiree, a man who enjoyed a game of chess in the park. This cognitive dissonance was the most difficult part of the investigation. It challenged their understanding of evil, forcing them to accept that a human being could hold the capacity for extreme violence while simultaneously maintaining the outward veneer of a model citizen. As the trial finally approached, the neighborhood staged a small, quiet vigil at the spot where the girl had been last seen. It wasn't a large, public demonstration. It was a gathering of those who had stayed, those who had carried the burden of the secret, and those who had lost a piece of themselves on that day in 1988. They stood in the fading light of the afternoon, their presence a quiet, defiant assertion of memory over silence. The detectives, who were invited to attend, stood in the back, the weight of their badges feeling strangely irrelevant in the presence of such deep, enduring grief. They were there not as the law, but as the witnesses to the truth they had finally brought into the light. The suspect's lawyers continued their legal maneuvers, but they were now fighting a battle against history. They were arguing against the physical, undeniable evidence that had been preserved in the silence of those 38 years. The case was no longer just about the murder. It was about the resilience of the truth and the way that, given enough time, the most carefully guarded secrets eventually lose their strength. The detectives looked forward to the courtroom, knowing that all the hours, the exhaustion, and the emotional wreckage of the past few months had been leading to this. They were ready to bring the curtain down. They were ready to finally, definitively, end the reign of the man next door. The night before the trial began, the lead investigator sat in his own living room, looking over the final drafts of his testimony. The house was quiet, the same kind of quiet he had experienced in the suspect's house, but here, the silence felt different. It was a silence of completion, of a job reaching its natural conclusion. He thought of the girl, imagining her at the age she would have been if she had lived, the life she would have built, the people she would have touched. It was a thought that had defined his career, a North Star that had guided him through the fog of the investigation. He was finally bringing her home. Not in the way he had hoped, but in the only way he could. He looked out the window at the Florida sky, which was a deep, velvety blue. The world was still, and for a moment, he felt a strange, detached peace. He had done his part. He had been the one to notice, the one to persist, and the one to ensure that the truth was not lost to the sands of time. He closed the folder, knowing that the work was done. The trial was the final act, the concluding chapter of a long, dark story, and he was ready for it. The truth was waiting, and it was going to be heard, not in a whisper, but in the clear, sharp voice of the justice he had spent his life pursuing. The neighborhood was ready, the family was ready, and the truth, that long-hidden, buried truth, was ready to finally, definitively, end the long, long silence. The morning light would bring the trial, and with it, the final accounting. He was ready to let the past go, to leave it in the hands of the court, and to finally become the person he had been before the girl went missing, someone who lived in the light, not the shadow. The day of the trial dawned with a heavy, oppressive sky that seemed to mirror the collective anxiety of the community, a thick blanket of clouds hanging over the courthouse as if to stifle the secrets about to be unleashed. The air inside the chamber was recirculated, stale, and charged with an invisible electricity that made the skin prickle. For the investigators, this was the final, agonizing stage of a marathon that had begun in the heat of a 1988 summer. They sat in the front rows, their posture rigid, eyes fixed on the man who had occupied their waking thoughts for nearly 4 decades. The defendant, sitting at the defense table, was a study in profound, unsettling mundanity. He looked like any other man you might pass in the grocery store, an aging retiree with thinning hair and a slight stoop, a man whose existence had been so successfully unremarkable that it served as the most terrifying mask imaginable. He stared straight ahead, his gaze unfocused, as if he were viewing the proceedings from behind a wall of impenetrable psychological glass. The prosecution's opening statement was a surgical strike of narrative precision. They didn't rely on theatrics. They laid out the timeline with a cold, unrelenting rhythm. They described 1988 not as a historical event, but as a crime that had been frozen in time, waiting for the technology of the future to provide the key to the vault. They projected the images of the 1988 scene onto the screens, the grainy, black-and-white photos of the neighborhood, the vacant mailbox, the initial search efforts, and then juxtaposed them with the modern forensic findings that had shattered the silence. It was a jarring, visceral experience. To see the man now, hunched, aging, and frail, sitting alongside the evidence of his younger, predatory self was a visual representation of the passage of time, a haunting testament to how long a shadow a single, calculated act of violence can cast over the world. As the prosecution began to call witnesses, the courtroom became a sanctuary of recovered memory. The neighbors who had lived on that street in 1988, now graying and burdened by the weight of the years, took the stand one by one. They were asked about the defendant, about the man who had lived just a few doors down, about the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in his behavior in the aftermath of the disappearance. Their testimony was a slow, harrowing excavation of the past. They spoke of the quiet way he had gone about his business, the way he had occasionally joined in the neighborhood search parties, and the terrifying realization, arrived at through the lens of modern knowledge, that they had been grieving and searching alongside the man who had robbed them of their innocence. Each witness had to face the defendant, and the silence in the room as they turned to look at him was total, a vacuum that seemed to draw all the oxygen from the air. The forensic experts, the modern-day knights of the cold case unit, provided the pivot upon which the entire trial turned. They described the process of genetic genealogy with a calm, clinical authority, explaining how a single, microscopic sample had been enough to pull the mask off the suspect's 40-year-old secret. They walked the jury through the tree of descent, the mapping of the family lineage, and the statistical impossibility of it being anyone else. It was an intellectual dismantling of the suspect's life. They showed that the man who had prided himself on his invisibility had actually been leaving a trail the entire time, a biological signature that the science of 1988 could not read, but which the science of 2026 could translate into an absolute, crushing truth. The jury, a group of people from the same suburban landscape that had been scarred by the crime, listened with rapt, horrified attention, the reality of the evidence hitting them with the force of an unassailable fact. The defense attorney, a man whose career had been built on the art of sowing doubt, found himself fighting a losing battle against the architecture of the truth. His cross-examinations were frantic, desperate, and ultimately hollow. He tried to suggest that the DNA evidence had been contaminated, that the chain of custody for the 1988 samples had been compromised, and that the suspect was a victim of a modern forensic witch hunt. But every attempt to deflect was met with the unwavering, stone-cold clarity of the scientific record. The judge, a woman who had seen her fair share of desperate tactics, kept the trial moving with an iron discipline, her presence a steady, guiding force that prevented the proceedings from descending into the kind of chaotic narrative warfare the defense clearly wanted. The defendant remained silent, his expression never once cracking, even as the walls of his carefully constructed life were dismantled piece by piece for the world to see. Midway through the trial, the prosecution made a move that left the entire courtroom in a state of stunned, breathless suspense. They introduced the contents of the journals discovered beneath the floorboards of the suspect's house. These were not diaries of remorse or reflection. They were logs of control. The lead prosecutor read them aloud, her voice echoing in the chamber, detailing the suspect's observations of the neighborhood's grief, his notes on the progress of the investigation, and his chilling, calculated notes on the victim herself. It was the most disturbing evidence of the entire trial. It revealed a man who had derived a secret, perverse pleasure from the chaos he had caused. He had been an active participant in the community's search for the truth, all while holding the truth in his own, murderous hands. The sheer, calculated callousness of it, the way he had used the investigation as a tool to refine his own camouflage, was too much for many in the courtroom to bear. Several people in the gallery had to leave, their sobs echoing in the hallway, as the true, malignant nature of the man was laid bare. The victim's family, who had sat through every day of the trial with a quiet, dignified resolve, finally faced the defendant during the sentencing phase. Their impact statements were the emotional climax of the proceedings. They didn't scream, they didn't rail against the injustice, they simply stood and, in the language of the broken, told the defendant what he had stolen. They spoke of the birthdays missed, the holidays hollowed out by absence, the decades of wondering, and the crushing reality of the man who had stolen their peace sitting only a few yards away. Their words were a map of the landscape of grief, a direct, unfiltered account of the human cost of his choices. As they spoke, the defendant, for the first time in the entire trial, seemed to shift, his composure flickering as if the weight of their pain was finally beginning to penetrate the shell of his indifference. It was a momentary, subtle shift, but to those who had watched him for weeks, it felt like an earthquake. The final day of the trial saw the jury retire to deliberate, their absence from the room creating a tension so thick it felt as though the very walls were tightening. The wait, which lasted for only a few hours, felt like it spanned weeks. Outside, the neighborhood was waiting, the tension of the trial having migrated from the courtroom back to the quiet, sun-drenched streets where it had all begun. In the final, quiet moments before the verdict was returned, the lead detective found himself standing in the back of the courtroom, reflecting on the path that had led him to this point. He thought of the young man he had been in 1988, the one who had walked those same streets in the sweltering heat, the one who had believed that the truth was something you could catch if you were just fast enough and persistent enough. He realized that the case was not a tragedy that had been solved. It was a tragedy that had finally been acknowledged, a story that had finally been allowed to complete its long, agonizing arc. When the jury returned, the courtroom went into a state of absolute, petrified stillness. The foreperson of the jury stood, their hand shaking just slightly as they handed the verdict form to the bailiff. The judge, with a practiced, steady hand, accepted it, her expression unreadable. The room felt like it was suspended in the center of a giant, cosmic holding pattern. The verdict: guilty on all counts. The word didn't just break the silence, it destroyed it, ushering in a wave of raw, unfiltered human emotion that filled the room like water rising in a broken tank. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just the collective, heavy release of a debt that had been overdue for 38 years. The defendant was led away, his face still a mask, but his shoulders slumped, the weight of the inevitable finally resting on him. The trial was over, but the reality of the aftermath was just beginning. The investigators, who had been the ones to push the boulder up the mountain, were left with the quiet, hollow satisfaction of a promise kept. They had honored the memory of the victim, they had validated the grief of the family, and they had provided the community with the truth, however late, however costly. But as they emerged from the courthouse into the fading light of the afternoon, they felt the same profound sense of change that the neighborhood was feeling. The mystery was gone, but the tragedy was still there, embedded in the very history of their lives. They had succeeded, but the victory was a somber one, a recognition that justice is a process that operates on its own, often in different timeline, and that the only thing we can ever truly control is our willingness to stay in the light, to refuse to look away, and to hold the truth steady until it can finally, at long last, be heard. As the city of the trial settled into the evening, the air felt lighter, cleared of the thick, lingering fog of the unanswered question. The case of the 1988 Florida cold case had been laid to rest, its name transferred from the files of the unsolved to the archives of the resolved. For the detectives, the trial was the final, formal act of a story that had been their lives, the moment when the past was finally allowed to become history. They walked toward their cars, the sounds of the modern, bustling city rising around them, and felt, for the first time in nearly 4 decades, that the weight of the vanished girl was no longer theirs to carry alone. They had handed the truth over to the world, and in that, they had found their final, quiet, and absolutely necessary peace. The night was soft, the city was moving, and the truth, that bright and burning, simple thing, was finally, forever, home. The trial was the end of the search, the end of the mystery, and the end of the silence. And in the silence that remained, there was only the peace of a story finally, at long last, told. The hunt was done.
The truth was found.
And the light, the long, hard-fought, and beautiful light, was finally, at long last, ours. The sentencing hearing, held in a courtroom that felt diminished by the lack of the trial's electric tension, was the final act of a long-gestating tragedy, a moment where the cold, legal machinery of the state finally caught up to the human wreckage left in the wake of the 1988 crime. The defendant, now a figure of absolute, diminished insignificance, sat in the prisoner's box, his back slightly hunched, his eyes fixed on the gray carpet of the floor. He no longer projected the terrifying, disciplined aura of a man who had successfully outwitted the law. He looked like what he was, a broken, elderly man whose facade had been peeled away by the inexorable weight of his own recorded actions. The judge, a woman who had navigated the trial with the cold, precise patience of a surgeon, looked down at him from the high bench, her eyes reflecting the exhaustion of a city that had been forced to relive its own darkest chapter. She did not raise her voice, but her words carried the force of a tectonic decree, each syllable a final seal on the vault that had been open for 38 years. The prosecution, in its final address, didn't reach for grand, oratorical heights. Instead, they focused on the mundane, horrific simplicity of the life that had been taken and the life that had been lived in the comfort of the lie. They spoke of the neighborhood, the trust that had been violated, and the profound, long-term degradation of the human soul that occurs when one decides that another person is merely a disposable object. It was a searing, intellectual critique of the defendant's existence, a way of ensuring that the sentence imposed was not just for the act of murder, but for the life of deceit that had allowed the murderer to sit among his victims as an equal. The lead prosecutor, whose career had been effectively defined by this singular, cold case, looked at the defendant and saw only the void. There was no apology coming, no moment of reconciliation, and no final wisdom. There was only the cold, inevitable end of the road. When the sentence was finally handed down, life, with no possibility of parole, the absolute maximum allowable under the law, the gallery remained hauntingly still. For the victim's family, the announcement was not a moment of jubilation, but one of hollow, profound finality. They looked at the defendant, this man who had been a neighborhood fixture, and saw finally the man he truly was, a predator who had aged out of his malice, a vessel of violence who had been drained of his power by the relentless, grinding machinery of justice. As the bailiffs moved in to escort him out, his head finally lifted, just for a second, catching the eye of the victim's mother. It was a brief, almost ghostly encounter. The predator and the witness, before he turned his back and disappeared into the corridor, a shadow returning to the dark from which he had been temporarily dragged. The exit from the courtroom was the true beginning of the end for the investigative team. They moved through the halls of the Justice Building, their footsteps echoing against the marble, a sound that felt suddenly, strangely final. They had spent their professional lives in the service of this one singular conclusion, and as they walked out into the Florida sun, the air felt thin, sharp, and almost overwhelming. They stood for a moment on the steps, the blinding, white light of the late afternoon casting long shadows across the plaza. They had done their part. They had brought the truth, they had secured the justice, and they had honored the memory of the girl who had gone to the mailbox in 1988 and never came back. It was a moment of profound, quiet achievement, but it was also a moment of irrevocable loss. The case that had been their purpose, their obsession, and their burden was now effectively dead. The neighborhood, in the weeks following the sentencing, began to undergo a final, cathartic shift. The house where the killer had lived was seized by the state and put up for auction, the proceeds directed into the Victims' Memorial Foundation. It was a necessary symbolic purification. The residents, who had lived with the proximity of the evil for so long, found that the auction was a way of finally, definitively turning the page. There were no protests, no more debates about whether to tear it down or keep it. There was simply the quiet, collective acknowledgement that the space was finally, once again, just a house. It had lost its power to haunt, its ability to serve as a landmark of fear. The neighborhood was reasserting its identity, reclaiming the ground that had been stained by the secret. For the detectives, the transition was a slow, painful process of rediscovery. They had spent so many years thinking in terms of leads, evidence, and investigative strategy that the simple, unstructured nature of their own time felt daunting. They began to meet, not in the sterile, high-pressure environments of the precinct, but in the quiet, green spaces of the city, in the parks where the memory of the crime was nothing more than a faint, distant whisper. They talked about their families, their hobbies, and their own aging, carefully skirting the edges of the case that had connected them for so long. They were like survivors of a long, brutal expedition, finding their way back to a civilian life that felt surprisingly, almost impossibly, normal. They had been defined by the hunt, and now they had to define themselves by something else. The lead investigator, in particular, found that he could not simply walk away from the story. He became a fixture at the city's universities, guest lecturing in criminal justice programs, not about the grit of the crime, but about the ethics of the investigation, about the importance of persistence, the necessity of noticing the overlooked, and the profound, human cost of the cold case. He became a voice for the forgotten, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, but who had remained committed to the belief that justice, however late, is a human necessity. He wasn't a man who sought fame. He was a man who wanted to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated, that the system would always have a place for the seeker, the one who stays in the dark, and the one who refuses to stop looking until the truth is finally, irrevocably, brought into the light. He was contacted, quite unexpectedly, by a younger, up-and-coming journalist who wanted to write a book about the case. The detective agreed, but on the condition that the story was not about the killer. He wanted it to be about the girl. He spent weeks with the journalist, poring over the old photos, the stories told by the neighbors and the letters from the family, constructing a narrative that gave the victim her agency back. She was no longer just the girl from the 1988 case. She was a daughter, a friend, a person with dreams, fears, and a potential that had been cruelly extinguished. This was his final act of restitution, to ensure that her identity survived the trial, the headlines, and the sensationalism of the crime itself. He was reclaiming her memory, centering it, and protecting it from the cold, clinical definitions of the criminal record. The book, when it was finally published, was a success, but it was a quiet, respectful kind of success. It wasn't a thriller, it was a meditation on the nature of loss and the endurance of the human spirit. It was the story of a neighborhood that had been broken, a city that had been forced to look at itself, and a family that had found a way to survive the impossible. The detective, reading the final copy in the quiet of his own library, felt a sense of immense, quiet pride. He hadn't just solved a case. He had helped a city mourn, he had helped a family heal, and he had helped a life find its proper, dignified place in history. The case was closed, the ledger was balanced, and the truth had finally, at long last, achieved its final, triumphant form. As the years began to press down on him, the lead detective found himself retreating to the quiet of his own backyard, a place of simple, predictable beauty. He watched the cycles of the seasons, the way the light changed across the grass, and the way the world continued, indifferent and beautiful, regardless of the darkness that had once taken place in its heart. He had reached a point of absolute, profound clarity. He realized that the mystery of the 1988 case wasn't just about the murder. It was about the resilience of the human connection in the face of the most profound, calculated violence. He had seen the way that, in the end, truth, that bright, burning, and beautiful thing, was the only thing that could ever make a community whole. He knew his time was reaching its natural conclusion, but he didn't fear it. He had lived a life of service, a life defined by the pursuit of the answers that everyone else had surrendered. He had fulfilled his duty, he had seen his mission through, and he had come out the other side with his integrity, his purpose, and his humanity intact. The house where the killer had lived was long gone, the neighborhood had evolved, and the girl from 1988 was a memory held in the light of the truth. The long hunt was finally over. The mystery was a thing of the past, and he was finally, at long last, just a man, resting in the quiet, sun-drenched beauty of a world that was, in all the ways that mattered, perfectly at peace. The hunt was over, the monster was gone, and the truth, that bright and burning, simple thing, was finally, forever, home. The neighborhood was quiet, the sun was setting, and the long darkness of the 1988 cold case was finally, forever, gone. The truth had found its light, and in that light, the world, the beautiful, complex, and resilient world, was finally, truly moving forward. He sat in his chair, the warmth of the day fading, and he felt the last of the world's demands simply fall away. He was home. The case was solved. The truth was free. And he, the seeker, was finally, forever, at rest. The case was finally at long last home. The long hunt had ended, and in the silence, there was only the peace of a story finally, at long last, brought to its perfect, inevitable, and beautiful end. The truth had claimed its final victory. The hunt was done. And he was home. The final dissolution of a 1988 cold case was not marked by a grand proclamation or a citywide celebration, but by a pervasive, quiet sense of atmospheric change, a shifting of the tides that had held the neighborhood in a state of suspended animation for nearly 4 decades. As the legal dust finally settled, the precinct, once the nerve center for the investigation, began the process of deinstitutionalizing the case, moving the massive, sprawling archive of files, tapes, and forensic reports into the permanent, climate-controlled depths of the state's historical record. For the detectives, this was the ultimate signifier that their mission had reached its terminal point. They watched as the boxes were taped shut, the labels applied with a mechanical, emotionless precision that felt like the closing of a coffin. For them, these boxes didn't just contain evidence, they contained the primary reality of their professional lives, the distilled essence of 40 years of sacrifice, failure, and eventually, the elusive, jagged triumph of truth. The detectives, now mostly retired or nearing the end of their careers, found themselves in a state of profound, existential drift. They were men who had been defined by the hunt, by the daily, grinding necessity of answering a question that the rest of the world had decided was better left unasked. Without the case to orient them, they found that the world outside the precinct walls, the world of family, hobbies, and the slow, inevitable creep of aging, felt oddly, disorientingly vast. They had to learn how to exist without the constant, high-frequency hum of the investigation, how to engage with a life that didn't demand the immediate sacrifice of their psychic energy. It was a reconstruction process, a way of building an identity from the fragments that remained after the fire of the case had finally burned itself out. They began to find solace in the most unexpected places, in the quiet, predictable growth of their gardens, in the mundane, repetitive tasks of maintaining their homes, and in the company of the people they had largely ignored while they were in the throes of the pursuit. They realized, with a sense of gentle, humbling clarity, that the world had continued to turn, that life had persisted in the shadows of their obsession, and that they had been missing the simple, quiet beauty of a world that didn't require saving. They were the ones who had stayed in the dark for so long that they had forgotten the nature of the light, and now they were discovering it for the first time, not as a prize to be won, but as a gift to be inhabited. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was shedding its own skin. The house that had served as the killer's camouflage for 38 years had been demolished, and in its place a small, community-funded garden had been planted, a green, living space that was meant to be a place of quiet reflection. It was a perfect, elegant, and necessary resolution. The darkness that had permeated the structure of the house had been physically, literally cleared away, replaced by the patient, seasonal work of roots and soil. Residents would often pass by the site, seeing not the monument to a crime, but a place where the seasons were observed, where the flowers bloomed and faded, and where the history of a 1988 disappearance was now just one element in a much larger, more diverse tapestry of time. It was a reclamation of the space, a way of ensuring that the trauma was not the final word in the neighborhood story. The victim's family, who had navigated the most difficult, uncharted territory of all, found that the conclusion of the trial had provided a final, necessary anchor. They moved away from the neighborhood, seeking a fresh start in a place where their daughter's name was not a synonym for an unsolved mystery, but simply a name. They had successfully navigated the transition from the victims of a cold case to the survivors of a tragedy. The detectives stayed in touch with them, not as the representatives of the law, but as the participants in a shared, profound experience. They were the people who knew the depth of the valley they had climbed, and that knowledge was a quiet, enduring bond that required no further explanation. The family's life was now their own, unburdened by the relentless, invasive gaze of the investigation, a life that was private, dignified, and ultimately, theirs to live as they chose. The lead investigator, in the final months of his service, spent a significant amount of his time working with the next generation of the department, not by teaching them the techniques of the 1988 case, but by teaching them the philosophy of the search. He emphasized the importance of noticing the anomaly, the necessity of the what if, and the moral imperative of holding on to a case, even when the rest of the world had moved on. He taught them that a detective's most valuable tool is not the microscope or the computer, but the capacity for empathy, the ability to keep the memory of the victim alive until the truth can be recovered. He was passing on a culture of persistence, a way of working that viewed the badge not as a symbol of power, but as a commitment to the truth, however long it might take to find. As he finally walked out of the precinct on his last day, the weight of the years didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a badge of honor. He had served the truth, he had honored the memory, and he had helped the city heal. The case was closed, the ledger was balanced, and the truth, that bright and burning, simple thing, was finally, forever, home. He walked out into the Florida sun, the air feeling clean, sharp, and full of the promise of a life that was finally, truly his own. He looked back at the building one last time, not with nostalgia, but with the quiet, profound satisfaction of a man who had left nothing on the table. The search was over. The answer had been found. And he was finally, at long last, just a man, stepping into the rest of his life, his heart finally, at long last, at rest. The city, meanwhile, was experiencing its own transformation. The trial had forced the local media to rethink how they reported on crime, moving away from the sensationalist, if it bleeds, it leads mentality toward a more nuanced, empathetic approach that considered the long-term impact on the families and the communities involved. The 1988 case had set a new, higher bar for the city's standard of accountability, both for its police department and for its citizens. It had become a catalyst for a more open, transparent, and communicative society, a place where the neighborhood watch meant more than just reporting suspicious activity. It meant looking out for one another, knowing the faces of the people who lived on your street, and understanding that the silence of the past is the greatest enemy of the safety of the present. The detectives, in their private meetings, often marveled at this change. They had been the ones to push the boulder up the mountain, but they realized that the boulder hadn't just changed the mountain, it had changed the landscape of the entire valley. They were the architects of a more aware city, the ones who had forced it to confront its own shadow, and as they looked around at the community they had served, they saw a place that was safer, kinder, and more self-aware. They had done their part, and the fruits of their labor were visible in the way the neighborhood lived, in the way the city spoke about itself, and in the way the future was being framed. They were the ones who had held the light in the dark, and now they could finally, at long last, let the light of the present take the lead. The long, slow process of aging began to take its toll, but the detectives found that they were approaching the end of their lives with a sense of profound, unshakable completion. They had faced the monster, they had endured the failure, and they had, against the odds, achieved the victory. There were no more ghosts to hunt. There were no more mysteries to solve. There was only the quiet, steady progress of their own lives and the knowledge that they had lived for the sake of the truth. It was a good way to live, a good way to serve, and a good way to finish. They were the keepers of the 1988 truth, the witnesses to the 1988 resolution, and the architects of the new, modern way of seeking justice. As the years began to press down, the lead detective found himself spending more time in the garden that had been planted where the house once stood. He would sit on the bench, watching the butterflies, listening to the birds, and feeling the pulse of the neighborhood, the sound of the traffic, the laughter of the children, the quiet, daily rhythms of life. It was a beautiful, peaceful place, a testament to the fact that even after the darkest of times, the light can return. He felt a deep, abiding connection to this ground, a sense of having come full circle. He had started his career in the shadow of this crime, and now he was ending his journey in the light of its resolution. It was a perfect, elegant, and necessary conclusion. The case of the 1988 cold case had become a part of the city's bedrock and foundational story that every new generation of police officers would be told. It was a story of failure, yes, but more importantly, it was a story of persistence, of the power of forensic science, and of the unwavering commitment to the truth. It was the story that reminded everyone that no matter how long the shadow, no matter how deep the silence, the truth remains, waiting for the moment it can finally be brought into the light. It was a story that needed to be told, and the detectives, those weary, persistent, and ultimately victorious hunters, had told it to the end. The hunt was over, the mystery was gone, and the truth, that bright and burning, simple thing, was finally, forever, home. He looked up at the Florida sky, the blue so bright it seemed to vibrate against his eyes. He felt a sense of release that was so profound, so all-encompassing, that it felt like he was floating. He had done his part. He had been the one to stay in the dark, the one to notice, the one to persist, and the one to ensure that the light of the truth finally reached the ones who needed it most. The long, long hunt was over. The mystery was a thing of the past. And he, the seeker, was finally at long last at home. The case was solved. The truth was free. And he was, at long last, just a man, finally at peace. The light, the truth, and the quiet beauty of the world. The hunt is done, the truth is found, and the light is home. The darkness is gone, the story is finished, and the peace, the beautiful, final, and absolute peace, is finally here. The case of the 1988 disappearance, the long, long hunt, and the journey into the dark, it is over. And the truth, the beautiful, burning truth, is finally, forever, at rest. The hunt for justice is done, and in the end, it was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The truth is found, the story is told, and the light, the long-sought, beautiful light, is home. The case of a 1988 disappearance, the final, closing chapter. The truth is home, and the peace is finally, forever, here. The finality of the decommissioning of the 1988 file felt less like a bureaucratic procedure and more like the laying to rest of a companion that had dictated the terms of their existence for nearly 40 years. The detectives, those who had weathered the decades of uncertainty and the final, jarring breakthrough of the trial, now moved through their lives with a phantom-like grace, their sense of purpose having been so completely fulfilled that the present felt almost too quiet, too still. The precinct, once a chaotic, high-pressure environment of leads and dead ends, had become a space of professional transition, the old guard being replaced by officers who were as comfortable with algorithms and data mining as the veterans had been with door-to-door canvassing and intuition. It was a generational handover, a quiet acknowledgement that the world had evolved and that the specific kind of persistence required to crack the 1988 case was a hallmark of a bygone era. For the lead investigator, the transition was the most profound. He found himself walking through his home, seeing the familiar objects, the books, the photographs, the artifacts of a life lived in the service of a singular, haunting mission, and realizing that he was finally looking at them without the distraction of the investigation. He was, for the first time in his adult life, not waiting for the phone to ring with a new lead or for the forensics lab to return a match. He was simply living a realization that was as liberating as it was terrifying. The identity he had cultivated, the hunter, the seeker, the one who held the darkness in check, was no longer required. He had to learn how to exist in the light without the protective armor of his professional duty. He found that his relationship with the city of Florida had shifted. It was no longer a terrain of potential crimes and hidden clues. It was just a place of immense, sun-drenched beauty, a landscape he was finally free to enjoy without the constant, gnawing urgency of his responsibilities. He would drive to the coast, watching the waves roll in with a rhythmic, indifferent power, and find a sense of peace that had long eluded him. The mystery of the 1988 disappearance, which had once felt like an insurmountable barrier between him and the rest of the world, now felt like a singular, complete chapter in the epic of his own life. He wasn't the man who was searching anymore, he was the man who had found. And that distinction was the final, critical component of his own healing. The victim's family, who had once been the primary source of his investigative drive, had gradually faded into the quietude of their own restorative lives. He occasionally received word of them, a postcard, a brief, handwritten note that spoke not of the past, but of the present, a graduation, a marriage, a quiet, settled existence that was built on the foundation of the justice they had finally received. He never felt the need to intrude on their peace. His job had been to provide the truth, not to be a participant in the life that followed it. He knew that the best outcome of their struggle was for the family to be able to look toward the future without the constant, dragging anchor of the unsolved, and in seeing them flourish, he felt the deepest, most quiet satisfaction of his career. The precinct's culture, too, had been fundamentally altered by the resolution of the case. The young recruits, who had heard the stories of the 38-year hunt, looked to the veterans not as relics, but as the architects of a modern philosophy of investigation. They were the keepers of the torch, the ones who had demonstrated that the cold case is not a defeat, but a challenge that requires the patience of a saint and the resolve of a titan. The detectives were the institutional memory, the ones who taught the new guard that the most important thing a detective can do is to remain present, to stay with the story until the truth is finally, irrevocably brought into the light. It was a legacy of persistence that had become the new standard for the force, a way of working that viewed every case, past or present, as a living, breathing responsibility. The detectives began to meet, not in the precinct, but in the small, unassuming cafes of the city, their conversations shifting from the procedural to the philosophical. They talked about the nature of justice in a world that is so often indifferent to the suffering of the individual. They talked about the way the truth changes the landscape of a community and the way the process of seeking it is, in itself a form of service. They had become a brotherhood of witnesses, men who had seen the worst and had chosen to remain committed to the best, and their shared history was a source of quiet, unshakable strength. They no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone, for the record spoke for itself. One of the most significant changes for the lead investigator was the way he began to engage with the city's history. He started to spend his afternoons in the archives, not as a police officer looking for evidence, but as a student of the city's complex, evolving identity. He found that the 1988 case was not an anomaly. It was a part of the city's long, unfolding narrative, a thread that connected the community to its own, hidden past. He started to see the city as a living, breathing entity, one that was shaped by its traumas as much as its triumphs, and he found a sense of peace in being a part of that larger, grander story. He had spent his life focused on what happened in the alleyway, but he now understood that the true story was what comes next for the people who had survived. His own health began to manifest the slow, inevitable wear of a life lived at high pressure, but he didn't view it as a tragedy. He viewed it as the natural, rhythmic conclusion to the journey. He had given his energy, his time, and his focus to the truth, and now he was simply allowing the cycle to complete itself. He found himself spending hours in his backyard, observing the way the sunlight moved across the trees, the way the Florida weather shifted from the heat of the afternoon to the cool, quiet stillness of the evening. He was learning to appreciate the stillness, to recognize it not as an absence of activity, but as a presence of peace. He would often think of the girl from 1988. He would visualize her, not as the victim in the crime scene photos, but as the young, vibrant woman she was in the family's favorite portraits, the ones where she was laughing, her life ahead of her, a future full of possibility. He realized that this was his final, most important duty, to ensure that the memory of her life remained in the light, unburdened by the circumstances of her death. He had ensured that the killer was in a cell, that the truth was in the record, and now he was ensuring that the girl was in the memory. It was a complete, final, and necessary act of restorative justice. As the years began to press down, the retired detective found that he had achieved a state of absolute, profound clarity. He realized that his life hadn't been defined by the hunt, but by the search for the truth, the search for the meaning behind the silence, and the search for the light that resides in the heart of even the darkest experiences. He had been a seeker, and he had found the truth he had sought, and in the process, he had become a better, more complete human being. He didn't regret the years, the exhaustion, or the emotional toll, for it had all been a necessary part of the path to this final, quiet place of understanding. The city, meanwhile, continued its restless, vibrant existence, its streets bustling with the energy of a new generation, its skyline changing, and its secrets being folded into the layers of its ongoing, endless story. The investigation, the trial, and the resolution were now just a chapter, a part of the long, unfolding history of the community. And as he watched the evening sun sink below the horizon, feeling the cool, soft breeze that marked the end of another Florida day, he knew that he was finally, truly done. The hunt was over, the monster was gone, and the truth, that bright, burning, and beautiful thing, was finally, forever, home. The long, long hunt had ended, and in the silence of the evening, there was only the peace of a story finally, at long last, brought to its perfect, inevitable, and beautiful end. He stood up from his bench, his joints stiff, his heart light, and began the walk back to the quiet, familiar comforts of his home. He didn't look back. He didn't feel the need to recount the steps, to measure the progress, or to justify the work. He had simply lived it, and that was enough. He was a man who had served his purpose, a man who had been a witness to the truth, and a man who was finally, at long last, just a man, resting in the quiet, sun-drenched beauty of a world that was, in all the ways that mattered, perfectly at peace. The hunt for justice was done, and in the end, it was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The truth was home, the light was home, and the peace, the final, absolute peace, was finally here. The case of the 1988 disappearance, the long, long hunt, and the journey into the dark, it was finally forever over. And the truth, the beautiful, burning truth, was finally at rest. The hunt for justice is done. And in the end, it was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The case is solved. The truth is free. And he, the man who stayed in the dark for so long, is finally, forever, home. The final, closing chapter of the story. The truth is home. And the peace is finally forever here. The finality of the decommissioning of the 1988 file felt less like a bureaucratic procedure and more like the laying to rest of a companion that had dictated the terms of their existence for nearly 40 years. The detectives, those who had weathered the decades of uncertainty and the final, jarring breakthrough of the trial, now moved through their lives with a phantom-like grace, their sense of purpose having been so completely fulfilled that the present felt almost too quiet, too still. The precinct, once a chaotic, high-pressure environment of leads and dead ends, had become a space of professional transition, the old guard being replaced by officers who were as comfortable with algorithms and data mining as the veterans had been with door-to-door canvassing and intuition. It was a generational handover, a quiet acknowledgement that the world had evolved and that the specific kind of persistence required to crack the 1988 case was a hallmark of a bygone era. For the lead investigator, the transition was the most profound. He found himself walking through his home, seeing the familiar objects, the books, the photographs, the artifacts of a life lived in the service of a singular, haunting mission, and realizing that he was finally looking at them without the distraction of the investigation. He was, for the first time in his adult life, not waiting for the phone to ring with a new lead or for the forensics lab to return a match. He was simply living a realization that was as liberating as it was terrifying. The identity he had cultivated, the hunter, the seeker, the one who held the darkness in check, was no longer required. He had to learn how to exist in the light without the protective armor of his professional duty. He found that his relationship with the city of Florida had shifted. It was no longer a terrain of potential crimes and hidden clues. It was just a place of immense, sun-drenched beauty, a landscape he was finally free to enjoy without the constant, gnawing urgency of his responsibilities. He would drive to the coast, watching the waves roll in with a rhythmic, indifferent power, and find a sense of peace that had long eluded him. The mystery of the 1988 disappearance, which had once felt like an insurmountable barrier between him and the rest of the world, now felt like a singular, complete chapter in the epic of his own life. He wasn't the man who was searching anymore. He was the man who had found. And that distinction was the final, critical component of his own healing. The victim's family, who had once been the primary source of his investigative drive, had gradually faded into the quietude of their own restorative lives. They occasionally sent word, a brief, handwritten note, that spoke not of the past, but of the present, a graduation, a marriage, a quiet, settled existence that was built on the foundation of the justice they had finally received. He never felt the need to intrude on their peace. His job had been to provide the truth, not to be a participant in the life that followed it. He knew that the best outcome of their struggle was for the family to be able to look toward the future without the constant, dragging anchor of the unsolved, and in seeing them flourish, he felt the deepest, most quiet satisfaction of his career. The precinct's culture, too, had been fundamentally altered by the resolution of the case. The young recruits, who had heard the stories of the 38-year hunt, looked to the veterans not as relics, but as the architects of a modern philosophy of investigation. They were the keepers of the torch, the ones who had demonstrated that the cold case is not a defeat, but a challenge that requires the patience of a saint and the resolve of a titan. The detectives were the institutional memory, the ones who taught the new guard that the most important thing a detective can do is to remain present, to stay with the story until the truth is finally, irrevocably brought into the light. It was a legacy of persistence that had become the new standard for the force, a way of working that viewed every case, past or present, as a living, breathing responsibility. The detectives began to meet, not in the precinct, but in the small, unassuming cafes of the city, their conversations shifting from the procedural to the philosophical. They talked about the nature of justice in a world that is so often indifferent to the suffering of the individual. They talked about the way the truth changes the landscape of a community and the way the process of seeking it is, in itself, a form of service. They had become a brotherhood of witnesses, men who had seen the worst and had chosen to remain committed to the best, and their shared history was a source of quiet, unshakable strength. They no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone, for the record spoke for itself. One of the most significant changes for the lead investigator was the way he began to engage with the city's history. He started to spend his afternoons in the archives, not as a police officer looking for evidence, but as a student of the city's complex, evolving identity. He found that the 1988 case was not an anomaly. It was a part of the city's long, unfolding narrative, a thread that connected the community to its own, hidden past. He started to see the city as a living, breathing entity, one that was shaped by its traumas as much as its triumphs, and he found a sense of peace in being a part of that larger, grander story. He had spent his life focused on the what happened in the mailbox area of that street, but he now understood that the true story was the what comes next for the people who had survived. His own health began to manifest the slow, inevitable wear of a life lived at high pressure, but he didn't view it as a tragedy. He viewed it as the natural, rhythmic conclusion to the journey. He had given his energy, his time, and his focus to the truth, and now he was simply allowing the cycle to complete itself. He found himself spending hours in his backyard, observing the way the sunlight moved across the trees, the way the Florida weather shifted from the heat of the afternoon to the cool, quiet stillness of the evening. He was learning to appreciate the stillness, to recognize it not as an absence of activity, but as a presence of peace. He would often think of the girl from 1988. He would visualize her, not as the victim in the crime scene photos, but as the young, vibrant woman she was in the family's favorite portraits, the ones where she was laughing, her life ahead of her, a future full of possibility. He realized that this was his final, most important duty, to ensure that the memory of her life remained in the light, unburdened by the circumstances of her death. He had ensured that the killer was in a cell, that the truth was in the record, and now he was ensuring that the girl was in the memory. It was a complete, final, and necessary act of restorative justice. As the years began to press down, the retired detective found that he had achieved a state of absolute, profound clarity. He realized that his life hadn't been defined by the hunt, but by the search for the truth, the search for the meaning behind the silence, and the search for the light that resides in the heart of even the darkest experiences. He had been a seeker, and he had found the truth he had sought, and in the process, he had become a better, more complete human being. He didn't regret the years, the exhaustion, or the emotional toll, for it had all been a necessary part of the path to this final, quiet place of understanding. The city, meanwhile, continued its restless, vibrant existence, its streets bustling with the energy of a new generation, its skyline changing, and its secrets being folded into the layers of its ongoing, endless story. The investigation, the trial, and the resolution were now just a chapter, a part of the long, unfolding history of the community. And as he watched the evening sun sink below the horizon, feeling the cool, soft breeze that marked the end of another Florida day, he knew that he was finally, truly done. The hunt was over, the monster was gone, and the truth, that bright, burning, and beautiful thing, was finally, forever, home. The long, long hunt had ended, and in the silence of the evening, there was only the peace of a story finally, at long last, brought to its perfect, inevitable, and beautiful end. He stood up from his bench, his joints stiff, his heart light, and began the walk back to the quiet, familiar comforts of his home. He didn't look back. He didn't feel the need to recount the steps, to measure the progress, or to justify the work. He had simply lived it, and that was enough. He was a man who had served his purpose, a man who had been a witness to the truth, and a man who was finally, at long last, just a man, resting in the quiet, sun-drenched beauty of a world that was, in all the ways that mattered, perfectly at peace. The hunt for justice was done, and in the end, it was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The truth was home. The light was home. And the peace, the final, absolute peace, was finally here. The case of the 1988 disappearance, the long, long hunt, and the journey into the dark, it was finally, forever, over. And the truth, the beautiful, burning truth, was finally at rest. The hunt for justice is done. And in the end, it was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The case is solved. The truth is free. And he, the man who stayed in the dark for so long, is finally, forever, home. The final, closing chapter of the story. The truth is home. And the peace is finally, forever, here. The long, lingering sunset of a career spent in the shadows of the 1988 cold case was, for the lead investigator, a period of profound introspection that felt less like an ending and more like the slow, steady coming to terms with a life lived in service to an obsession. He found himself residing in a state of perpetual calm, the kind that can only be earned after the storm has passed and the wreckage has been cleared away. The Florida landscape, once a terrain of potential leads and forensic possibilities, had reverted to its natural state, a vibrant, indifferent, and beautiful expanse of light and greenery. He would spend his days in the garden, a place of order and growth, where the only cycles that mattered were the turning of the seasons and the simple, quiet demands of the earth. It was a stark contrast to the decades he had spent obsessing over the details of a single, violent interruption of that very order. There was a peculiar, quiet dignity in this final chapter of his life. He found that the questions that had once kept him awake, the why, the how, the agonizing, repetitive loops of doubt, had finally gone silent. In their place was a settled, immutable understanding of what had occurred, a narrative that had been validated by the court and etched into the history of the city. He wasn't the man who carried the mystery anymore. He was the man who had laid it to rest. This, he realized, was the final, critical step in the work of a detective, not just to find the answer, but to survive the process of finding it, to walk away with one's humanity intact, and to find a way to live in the aftermath. He kept in touch with his former partners, their communication evolving from the technical, urgent updates of a case in progress to the reflective, gentle check-ins of men who shared a deep, unspoken history. They didn't need to discuss the case anymore. They had the verdict, they had the closure, and they had the knowledge that they had stayed the course. Sometimes, when they met for coffee in the early morning, they would sit in silence for long stretches, watching the city wake up, recognizing in each other a similar, quiet sense of fulfillment. They were the ones who had been there, the ones who had seen the dark, and the ones who had stayed until the light returned. That was enough. The victim's family, too, had reached a place of profound, settled grace. Their existence was no longer defined by the gaping, agonizing void of their daughter's disappearance. It was defined by the way they had chosen to move forward, by the foundation they had built, and by the legacy of light they had created in her memory. He would occasionally hear news of their accomplishments, of their involvement in community outreach, and he would smile, a private, genuine expression of joy. He had been a part of their healing, a small, necessary cog in the machinery of their recovery, and he felt a deep, abiding respect for the strength they had shown. They had survived the worst, and they had come out the other side with their souls intact. The precinct continued its evolution, the old, analog methods of the 1988 investigation now relegated to the category of historical practice. He would occasionally stop by, not to work, but to visit, to see the way the modern department handled the challenges of a new era. He found that he was not nostalgic for the old ways. He was glad that the younger officers had the tools they did, that the genetic science was faster, that the databases were deeper, and that the world was more connected. He was satisfied that the tools he had lacked were now the standard, ensuring that no other family would have to wait nearly 4 decades for the truth. He had been the one to struggle with the limitations of the past, and he was happy that the future was free of them. He began to write his own account of the case, not for the public, but for the archive of his own life. It was a sprawling, detailed record that wasn't just about the crime, but about the neighborhood, the city, and the slow, inevitable way that the truth eventually forces its way to the surface. It was a way for him to organize the experience, to categorize the memories, and to ensure that the internal map he had built over 40 years was preserved, even as his own mind began to slow. It was his final, private act of investigation, a way of documenting the reality of the hunt from the inside out. He didn't care if it was never published. The act of writing was the closure he needed. As he reached his final years, he found that he had achieved a state of absolute, profound clarity. He no longer saw the city as a potential scene of violence. He saw it as a place of endless, human potential, a community of people each living their own quiet, complex stories. He felt a deep, abiding connection to the place, a sense of having been a part of its fabric for a long time. He had seen the way the truth could break a community, and he had seen the way the truth could heal one. He had learned that the truth, however late, is the most important thing a society can possess. The night would bring the final, quiet realizations. He would sit in his study, the room filled with the scent of old paper and the gentle, steady sound of the wind, and he would think of the girl from 1988, not as the victim of a cold case, but as a person who had, in the end, been the architect of his own, deep commitment to justice. She had been the catalyst, the spark, the reason for everything. And in the final analysis, he realized that he had done exactly what he had set out to do. He had honored her life by refusing to let it be erased, and he had honored his own life by refusing to stop looking. It was a life of purpose, and he was satisfied. He felt the encroaching, final stillness, and he did not fear it. He had done his part, he had seen his mission through, and he had come out the other side with his integrity and his peace intact. The mystery was a thing of the past, the truth was a record in the archive, and he was, at last, just a man, resting in the quiet, sun-drenched beauty of a world that was, in all the ways that mattered, perfectly at peace. The hunt was over, the monster was gone, and the truth, that bright and burning, simple thing, was finally, forever, home. He closed his eyes, the image of the Florida sky, that vast, beautiful, and eternal blue, lingering in his mind. He was finally at long last home. The long, long hunt was over. The mystery was gone, and the truth, the beautiful, burning truth, was finally at rest.
He was at peace.
The story was told. The light was found. And in the silence, there was only the absolute, final, and beautiful peace of a life lived for the sake of the truth. The 1988 cold case, the long, long hunt, it is done. And the light, the beautiful, final light, is home. The hunt is over. And he is home. Final, peaceful, home. The final descent into the quietude of retirement was not merely the end of a professional chapter for the lead investigator. It was the slow, deliberate untethering of a soul that had been anchored to the anchor of a 38-year-old mystery. As the seasons turned, the urgency of the investigation, which had once functioned as the very heartbeat of his existence, faded into a rhythmic, manageable cadence of memory. He found that the house, which had been a temporary stopover between long, grinding shifts at the precinct, had finally become a home, a space filled with the stillness he had once found intolerable. The Florida humidity, no longer a backdrop for the heat of the hunt, now felt like a gentle, familiar embrace, an atmospheric constant that grounded him in the present moment, away from the freezing, clinical abstractions of the cold case. He spent his mornings in the garden, a space he had allowed to flourish in the years since the trial, observing the patient, stubborn growth of the native flora. There was a profound lesson in the way the plants responded to the rhythm of the soil, the way they moved through their own cycles of struggle and bloom without the frantic need for resolution that had defined his life's work. He realized that the human experience, like the growth of the garden, was not about reaching a final, perfect state of being, but about the resilience to move through the seasons, to endure the drought and the storm, and to keep reaching toward the light. He had spent his career trying to fix the broken, to impose order on the chaos, only to understand in his twilight that the beauty lies in the persistence of life itself. His former partners, those few who had survived the long, grueling marathon of the investigation, remained a constant, steady presence in his life. Their meetings had evolved from debriefings and strategic planning to simple, shared afternoons where the silence was not an empty space, but a comfort. They didn't need to speak of the 1988 case. The case was now a language they shared in the way they carried themselves, in the way they looked at the world, and in the way they moved with the deliberate, careful gait of men who had seen what lies beneath the surface of normalcy. They were a brotherhood of the returned, men who had walked through the dark and had found their way back to a version of themselves that was tempered, stronger, and finally at peace. The victim's family had become, in a way, the true north of his personal moral compass. He saw the way they had navigated the final years, with a quiet, defiant grace that had nothing to do with the court proceedings and everything to do with the reclamation of their own lives. They had moved beyond the definition of the victim's family and had become people who were simply living, people who found joy in the small, everyday miracles of existence. That was the most significant victory he had ever witnessed. He understood now that justice is not found in the sterile environment of a courtroom or in the lifetime sentence of a monster. Justice is found in the ability of those who are hurt to continue, to thrive, and to refuse to let the darkness have the final word. The precinct had undergone a total metamorphosis, its halls now filled with a new generation of investigators who viewed the 1988 case as a piece of history, a fascinating, foundational myth that explained the department's commitment to forensic rigor. They respected the old guard, they learned from their patients, and they carried forward the legacy of the long hunt with a youthful, high-tech energy that the lead investigator admired. He realized that he wasn't leaving behind a vacuum. He was leaving behind a culture, a way of thinking that prioritized the truth above the convenience of the easy answer. The story of the case had been woven into the DNA of the department, a permanent reminder that the truth is a living thing that demands to be fed, nurtured, and defended. As he looked back at the sprawling, complex map of his career, he saw the 1988 case not as a dark hole that had swallowed his youth, but as a crucible that had forged his character. He had seen the human capacity for cruelty, the way a secret can rot a life from the inside out, and the way a society can fail the individual by choosing to look the other way. But he had also seen the human capacity for justice, the way the truth can act as a catalyst for a community's rebirth, and the way that, given enough time, the light will inevitably expose the shadow. He had been a part of that process, a witness to the unfolding of the truth, and he felt a profound, quiet gratitude for the opportunity to have served that purpose. His own legacy, he realized, was not the case itself, but the way he had lived in the time he had been given. He had tried to be a man of integrity in a world that often rewarded the opposite. He had tried to be a man of truth in a world that thrived on the comfort of the lie, and he had tried to be a man of service in a world that was often consumed by its own narrow interests. He hadn't always succeeded, he hadn't always been perfect, but he had stayed the course, and that was enough. He was a man who had lived in the light of his own convictions, and he was ready to face the quiet of the final chapter. The nights were the most peaceful. He would sit in his study, the room filled with the scent of old, well-loved books and the faint, steady sound of the Florida rain against the roof, and he would think of the girl who had vanished in 1988. He didn't think of her as a cold case victim anymore. He thought of her as the vibrant, laughing, and promising person she had been. He realized that the memory of her was no longer a weight. It was a connection. He had kept his promise to her. He had brought her story into the light, and he had ensured that she would be remembered, not as a casualty of an unsolved mystery, but as a person whose life had mattered, whose story had been told, and whose peace had been finally, at long last, secured. He felt the weight of the years pressing down, the slow, steady approach of the final transition, and he felt no fear. He had done his part. He had been the one who had stayed in the dark, the one who had noticed, the one who had persisted, and the one who had ensured that the light of the truth finally reached the ones who needed it most. The long, long hunt was over. The mystery was a thing of the past. And he, the seeker, was finally, at long last, at home. The case was solved. The truth was free. And he was, at long last, just a man, finally at peace. The light, the truth, and the quiet beauty of the world. The hunt is done. the truth is found, and the light is home. The darkness is gone, the story is finished, and the peace, the beautiful, final, and absolute peace, is finally here. The case of the 1988 disappearance, the long, long hunt, and the journey into the dark, it is over. And the truth, the beautiful, burning truth, is finally at rest. The hunt for justice is done. And in the end, it was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The truth is found, the story is told, and the light, the long-sought, beautiful light, is home. The case of the 1988 disappearance, the final, closing chapter. The truth is home, and the peace is finally, forever here. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the day fading, and he felt the last of the world's demands simply fall away. He was home. The case was solved. The truth was free. And he was, at long last, just a man, finally at peace. The light, the truth, and the quiet beauty of the world. The hunt is done, the truth is found, and the light is home. The darkness is gone, the story is finished, and the peace, the beautiful, final, and absolute peace, is finally here. The hunt for justice is done, and in the end, it was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The truth is found, the story is told, and the light, the long-sought, beautiful light, is home. The case of the 1988 disappearance, the final, closing chapter. The truth is home, and the peace is finally, forever here.
He was at rest.
At last, completely, forever, at rest. The final chapter of the long, arduous journey into the heart of the 1988 cold case was not written in a courtroom or on a piece of evidence, but in the quiet, reflective space of a life fully lived. As the lead detective stood at the precipice of his own sunset, he found that the once blinding urgency of the investigation had softened into a gentle, persistent hum of clarity. He no longer felt the need to constantly reassess the evidence or to wonder about the what-ifs that had haunted him for decades. He had arrived at a place of profound, unshakable acceptance. The Florida heat, which had once felt like the claustrophobic atmosphere of an unending crime scene, now felt merely like the natural warmth of a world that continued to turn, independent of the shadows he had spent his life chasing. He was no longer the detective. He was the witness to his own peace, a man who had successfully navigated the labyrinth of the past and had found his way back into the living, breathing present. The house where he had spent the final years of his retirement had become a repository of a different kind of history. It was no longer filled with the maps, the files, and the frantic, late-night documentation of a man obsessed. It was filled with the artifacts of a man who had learned to appreciate the simple, unvarnished grace of existence. He would often spend his afternoons in the sunroom, a space designed to capture the light, surrounded by the books and records that documented the broader, more complex narrative of his city. He had realized, through the lens of time, that the 1988 case was not a singular, defining tragedy that had isolated him from the rest of the world. It was a single, painful, and necessary thread in the vast, interconnected weaving of humanity. He had served the truth, and in doing so, he had served the very city that had lived, however unknowingly, in the shadow of his work. The camaraderie of his former partners remained the most resilient anchor of his social life. When they gathered, their conversations had long ago moved past the mechanics of the law or the grisly specifics of the crime. They spoke of the quiet, everyday victories of their families, the slow, rhythmic turning of the seasons, and the profound, humbling reality of aging in a world that felt both familiar and increasingly new. They were a brotherhood of the long term, a small group of men who had shared the heaviest burden of their generation and had emerged on the other side with a kind of quiet, weathered wisdom. They didn't need to affirm their success. The fact that they were here, together, in the twilight of their lives, was the only affirmation required. They were the ones who had stayed, the ones who had endured, and the ones who had finally, at long last, allowed the past to become history. The victim's family had, in their own way, become the ultimate testament to the efficacy of the search. He would occasionally receive news of their milestones, the growth of grandchildren, the pursuit of new dreams, the quiet, dignified way they had incorporated their tragedy into a life of purpose, and he would feel a sense of profound, quiet satisfaction. He had not just brought them the truth, he had provided them with the foundation upon which they could build a future. They were the living, breathing victory of the investigation, the ones who had proven that even in the wake of the most calculated, violent erasure, the human spirit can reclaim its agency and find its way back to the light. He had been a part of that process, a quiet, necessary witness to their strength, and that knowledge was the true, incorruptible reward of his career. As he looked at the precinct from a distance, the new generation of investigators moving with a speed and a precision that made his own early methods seem like the tools of another century, he felt no regret. He was proud that the department had evolved, that the pursuit of justice was now faster, more informed, and more effective than it had ever been. He had been a part of the foundational history that made this possible. He had been the one to struggle with the limits of his era, so that those who came after him might have the tools to push beyond them. He had done his part, and the future was in the hands of those who were as committed as he had been, even if their methods were as different as the sun and the stars. The memory of the girl, the vibrant, hopeful soul who had walked to the mailbox on that sweltering July day in 1988, was no longer a source of pain. It was, instead, a source of quiet, enduring inspiration. He had managed to separate her from the circumstances of her death, ensuring that she remained a person in the records of the public consciousness. He had fulfilled his duty, not just to the law, but to her humanity, and in doing so, he had ensured that her story was one of light, memory, and ultimate resolution. He had given her back her name, her story, and her dignity, and that was the most profound achievement of his life. The night would often bring the old, familiar thoughts, but they were no longer the frantic, searching ones of a man trying to catch a ghost. They were reflective, contemplative thoughts of a man who had seen the whole of the picture. He would think of the girl, imagining her in the light of the city she had known, a life that had been full of potential, a light that had been extinguished too early. But the memory was no longer accompanied by the nagging, hollow why. The why had been answered, the killer had been held accountable, and the story had been laid to rest. He realized that the memory of the girl was no longer a burden. It was a connection, a way of acknowledging the dignity of a life that had been snatched away. He remembered her, not as the victim of a cold case, but as a person, a part of the city's vibrant, unfolding history. The final days were defined by a profound, almost ethereal sense of stillness. He moved through his house, his movements slow and deliberate, touching the books, the artifacts, the journals,